Hello, I'm Stephen Croucher. I'm the head of school of communication, journalism, and marketing at Massey University in New Zealand. And I'd like to thank Mohan Dutta and the rest of the Care Center staff for welcoming me and allowing me to be here to give a talk today, this evening, whatever part of the world you're in, on prejudice and COVID-19. And as I go through this talk tonight, what I really want to talk about, or just wherever you are, is really talk about a few different things. And I'll go through those topics in just a few moments. In particular, what I want to talk about are 5 issues. First, I want to really talk about COVID-19, really where it came from, how it's spread, particularly its spread. It's just engulfed the world so rapidly. And so basically set the context by going through this idea of how it spreads so fast, which leads into the key theoretical construct that guides a lot of my research, integrated threat theory. And I don't want to get too deep into the theory and just talk about a bunch of theoretical jargon, but instead what I'd like to do is really show how this theory, ITT, could be used as a very applicable and practical theory to understand not only prejudice, which the theory focuses on, but how the theory can help us understand prejudice and fear in the context of a virus. By doing so, what I'll do is go through some examples of how ITT has been used to understand different minority-majority group interactions, particularly looking at the concept of intergroup communication, so how 2 groups interact with one another. So I'll go through some examples that, well, I find interesting, and I hope you find interesting as well. And then I'll go through the current study that's taking place that some colleagues and I are working on in, I believe, 15 nations at this time. And finally, go through some steps forward. Basically, I'll be asking for some help from hopefully some of you who are listening at this time, seeking some guidance, some advice, and maybe some potential collaborators. What I'd like to do is start off with a visualization of really how COVID-19 has spread. What was interesting is when you first see COVID-19, there's reports of it starting in December of 2019. Of course, COVID-19, 2019. We really see in Wuhan, China, the confirmed cases really in China, around 80,000 plus. But then look what happens in March. We see Italy, we see Spain overtaking. Then we see the US just skyrocketing in March and April, and growing and growing and growing and growing and growing throughout April. And the virus just spread so rapidly, particularly in the United States, and it's still continuing to grow. And we're basically at 3.94 million plus. And as of now, this was May 11th, over 4 million cases. But it's so interesting to see really how what Donald Trump called the Wuhan virus, a little bit of his rhetoric, which I'll talk about later. We see the cases growing so rapidly in one country, but then once it got out, the confirmed cases just spread so quickly in other countries. You see it again, just spreading so fast. It shows us a little bit about where we are. And so to review a little bit of that, over 4 million people are currently infected that we know of with the coronavirus, with COVID-19. That's who we know, confirmed cases. Over 275,000 deaths that we know of linked to the virus. And what's interesting is if we look globally around the world, what we're finding is over 65 million people are unemployed or furloughed, linked to the economic impacts of the virus. Now, this is really difficult to actually quantify or to actually link to a virus or any kind of health issue. But numerous economists in Europe, the United States, Australasia, are arguing that what has happened is many governments, companies, corporations are finding that due to lockdowns in many countries, they can actually argue that with the lockdown, this is how many people have become unemployed, have become furloughed, And 65 million, actually, according to a few economists in the US, is an underestimation. We're also seeing something that is really intriguing, which for me is actually what I want to focus on really tonight or today, is the unknown number of cases of discrimination, racism, prejudice, violence, murder, possibly other kinds of violent acts against people who are blamed, who are considered responsible for the spread of COVID-19. And so what we have here is throughout the United States, for example, you see cases of individuals being blamed. Here's one picture coming out of the United States where we see COVID-19, China, die. And there are numerous pictures of this throughout the United States, the UK, Europe, so many different countries of this virus being linked to China, but then another link being made to either China being blamed and violence and attacks against the country, but also against the people. And so we see the spread of COVID-19 being linked to prejudice against not only a people and a country, but against a whole way of life. What we see here is just a very stereotypical Asian woman, and then different fingers being pointed at the individual, either in rage, being pointing. So we see blame attribution going down, another point, a stop. And this was a picture put together by a group who is actually trying to combat prejudice for COVID-19 in the Los Angeles area. These pictures of build the wall, make America great again were very common during the first year or two of Trump's presidency in the United States. However, this picture in particular comes out of Arizona. And what was interesting about it is it's actually a protest to open up the economy. So it's actually linked to COVID-19, where what we see here is we see one protester holding up a sign, build the wall, not for economic reasons to keep out Mexicans or to keep out Latin Americans, but in this case, to build the wall is become synonymous for this one protester to opening up the economy and to COVID-19. While for the other one in the back, Trump, make America great again, is now linked with COVID-19. So Trump is the savior who can come in on a white horse, make America great again by protecting them from COVID-19 and opening up the economy. For example, earlier today, I was going to Nate Silver's 538.com, which is a really interesting website which collates numerous surveys and statistical reports looking at basically how are statistics trending. And one of the things it was finding is that only 38% of Americans are afraid of contracting the virus, while over 55% are afraid of its economic effects. And we can see a bit of that in this one news picture. What we also see is over the past few months, since February 2nd till March 25th, a drastic spike in hate speech toward China and the Chinese. If you look here, over 900% spike on Twitter, just in hate speech. Because the idea that this virus has been spread, and it's been spread by this group. So this group has become the target of hate, target of animosity. If you look to Italy, it's not just the US, but this idea of we have a pandemic of ignorance that we must protect ourselves from. So we see interesting campaigns coming out from around the world, campaign of ignorance. We also see in Germany a group of refugees who have been given masks by one of the United Nations human rights groups to protect them, but also the masks protect others who interact with them. So it's interesting to see this picture in one of the German newspapers depicting how COVID-19 has now changed how we see refugees in Germany. And later we'll have another picture looking at how refugees are depicted in Germany. Further, if we look to the UK, and we'll see other pictures of Christmas Island refugees quarantine, and in Australia we'll see similar pictures of I am not a virus, I am still a person, but this idea of people being equated, particularly Asians, being equated with being a virus. Je ne suis pas un virus. I'm not a virus. But once again, this depiction of, in many cases, the stereotypical Asian being the virus. The last two, before I get really into the theory itself, is we have this one man in Italy who has been standing out saying, I am not a virus, I'm a human, eradicate the prejudice. And in many cases, people have been walking up, hugging him, which I don't know if that's the right thing to do either. When we're trying to social distance and keep ourselves away from others, even if they're not infected. But people have been coming up to him, hugging him, or people have been coming up saying, thank you, I appreciate you. But he's been standing out day and night to encourage and to try to fight against prejudice. But all this comes down to this idea of, I'm not a virus. But the belief and the fear has been that people are. Particularly in many countries, what we see is the target normally is a minority in that dominant cultural group, which leads to integrated threat theory. Always checking my time here so I don't go on forever. If we look to integrated threat theory comes out of social psychology. And a lot of the research that I use, even though I am in communication, is most of the work I draw on isn't just in communication studies. A lot of it comes from anthropology, psychology, sociology, organizational studies. It is fairly multidisciplinary. And Stephan's work, going back to 1993 and 1996, drew a lot on the work of Allport, going back to 1952 and 54, really looking at intergroup dynamics. And the key really came down to the argument that when a dominant group interacts with a minority, a few things happen. One of the first things that happens is that when a dominant group, or a large, or let's say the majority, interacts with the minority, what happens is that they will believe that the dominant group will believe that the minority could change them in some ways. Because when two groups interact, there's going to be disagreement. There's of course going to be good things that happen. There's going to be some sort of blending, getting along. There's going to be positive interaction. There's going to be negative contact, negative intergroup contact, and positive intergroup contact. But what happens though is when individuals in the dominant group believe that their group is threatened, there's going to be prejudice, particularly when like their identity is threatened. Think about things like social identity, for example. And what happens is therefore a prejudice emerges to defend. Now, a couple of key points. First, the minority group may not be threatening at all. It's just the belief from the dominant group that they are threatened. That's enough to really produce prejudice. And there's four kinds of threats that the dominant group will often feel when they encounter a minority. So let's take, for example, in the United States, one of the groups that's been studied quite extensively, and I've done quite a bit of work on this, are Muslim or are immigrants from predominantly Islamic countries. So let's say a white, predominantly Protestant individual, so a white Protestant man. If he might believe that Muslims are coming in and changing our society. And there was a lot of research that came out on this after September 11th, where many white American Christians believe that Muslims are coming in and they're producing realistic threats, symbolic threats. There are stereotypes and intergroup anxiety. So these four threats were part of this rhetoric around the Muslim invasion of the United States, or the Mexican immigrant invasion of the US, the refugee invasion of the EU, the North African invasion of France, and so on, where members of the dominant culture believe that minority groups are changing and threatening their way of life. So what I'll do is I'll go through all four of these kinds of threats briefly, and then from there I'll talk about how these fit when it comes to COVID-19 and how we're really seeing this happen at this time, which is really influencing how we can look at viruses and health as ways in which prejudice manifest. First is realistic threats. What we see is these are really economic, physical, political, other types of threats that impact our resources. And so when there's competition for resources, this leads to prejudice and discrimination. So for example, what you'll see is that in many places, individuals will see that when immigrants come in, they believe that immigrants take away their economic capability. They take away their ability to achieve. Before I came to New Zealand, I was living in Finland for about 5 years. And what was interesting is during the refugee crisis in the EU, where we had in Europe many refugees coming in from Turkey, Africa, Iran, I don't like to use the term Middle East, but basically the western part of Asia. A lot of the rhetoric happening in Finland even was that these immigrants are taking away jobs, they're taking away resources from the government, they're taking space. So we see economic threats, physical space. What happens if these individuals become citizens and they get voting rights? Are we going to have, Syrian members of parliament? Are they going to change our laws? So there's political threats. So all these things get into the lexicon, they get into the conversation, and people start talking about this. In 2005, I was living in France doing my doctoral work, and one of the things that the talking heads or the people on the news were talking about is, do we want 90 million Muslims in Europe? Well, what was happening is this was when Turkey was petitioning to become a full member of the European Union. So many European Union countries were arguing against bringing in Turkey because of the idea of allowing Turkish membership in the EU would lead to easier mobility of Turkish citizens throughout the European Union, which many of these pundits on French television were saying that would lead to higher unemployment in France. It would lead to harder access to healthcare for real, quote unquote, French citizens. It would lead to more people coming into France becoming citizens. So it would lead to more Muslim members of the French parliament and so on and so on, which leads to feelings of fear, which leads to prejudice. We also see symbolic threats. This is the idea that the minority will change the majority's culture in some way. They'll change their way of life, the values, beliefs, norms, the systems, because their views are different than our views. I saw this quite a bit when I was doing my doctoral work on the wearing of the hijab or the veils in France, particularly among North African Muslim women. When I would interview French Catholics, one of the things that many of them said, particularly French Catholics who were secular, they would argue that the idea of hijab, the idea of wearing a veil of any kind, was the antithesis of French secularism, separation of church and state. So their fear was that these Muslims, as they said, coming in was changing what it meant to be French. And that the more we allowed these Muslims to come in, they were completely changing what French people had fought against since the French Revolution. And soon, many French feared they wouldn't have secularism anymore. So we see here this minority that came in, who many of them, did wear a hijab, did wear a veil of some kind. To the dominant culture, the fear was their act of wearing a garment ran against this notion of secularism. So the fear was that it would change the whole concept that has been really the bedrock of French political and philosophical thought since 1789, 1788, 1789, particularly since 1901. So we see a lot of fear here over the symbolic idea. Same thing in the United States with the belief that, the US is a Christian nation, even though there is a separation of church and state, with more and more Muslims and coming into the US, many Americans believe, Christian Americans believe that the Muslims are going to come in and change what it is to be American by making it less Christian. This frightens a lot of people, and it leads to prejudice. It leads to disliking the minority group. It leads to negative attitudes. We also see a lot of negative stereotypes. Integrated threat looks a lot at the idea that we expect people to behave in specific ways. And we have these negative outgroup stereotypes. They're related to fear and threat. So for example, when I was living in Finland, many individuals, many Finns have these beliefs about Russians, where when Russians come in, particularly, Russian men are expected to be brutes, they're expected to be alcoholics, they're expected to be related to criminals. Many Russian women are expected to come in just to be brides, and they're basically not the most classy of women. And what we see then really is these stereotypes are perpetuated. People keep spreading these kinds of stereotypes the more they interact, particularly have any negative interaction. And what it leads to is it leads to more and more negative beliefs about groups. And this does not lead to positive group interaction. But the final part of integrated threat is this idea of intergroup anxiety, is that when we are interculturally interacting with a group that is not from our own group, so if we interact with someone who's not from our own in-group, we have anxiety. It can be good or bad. I can tell you the first time I went overseas, I was in high school, and I went to Barcelona to visit an exchange student that we had. I was anxious. I had anxiety. I was worried that I was going to do something stupid when I got off the plane or met his parents. It's a good kind of anxiety then. I was nervous and I wanted to do the right thing. But then there's the negative anxiety, where people don't want to interact with others because they look down on them. It's a form of ethnocentrism. And that anxiety basically leads them to either dislike the group, avoid the group, and so on. What happens though is the more realistic fears, the more symbolic fears we have, the more stereotyping we do, it increases our intergroup anxiety. These are all related to one another. And we see intergroup anxiety is this feeling of being threatened by these interactions. We're so nervous about these interactions, so worked up through these interactions, that in many ways, it just means that we just don't want to have them. We just don't like people who are different than us. And it cripples our ability really to interact with, as Said would call, the other. And so if we look to integrated threat, that's a little background of it, is we have realistic, symbolic threats, we have stereotyping, and we have intergroup anxiety. There's been a lot of research conducted on integrated threat. And as we go through this, what you'll do is you'll see how some of this could very easily fit into our understanding of things such as health, viruses, and so on. A lot of it's been done on religious groups, specifically looking at Islam. A lot of it's been done on immigrant groups, homophobia, and HIV/AIDS. So I'll go through all four of those. First, we look to religious groups. These two news articles are, for me, really interesting. The first one is Choisissez votre banlieue, vote front, which is basically choose your suburb, vote front, vote for the National Front. And how decades of depression and despair ignited a revolt in France's suburbs. I mentioned earlier that my doctoral work looked at the wearing of the hijab, the wearing of the veil in France. In 2005, France broke out into riots and martial law was declared throughout many of the suburbs. I was there when this happened. And it was interesting. I was visiting and staying with Muslim families in the suburbs of France. I was in Clichy-sous-Bois, which is where some of the most violent riots broke out. And what we saw was really, since then, and in follow-up research that I've conducted, it's been really intriguing to see how the different groups have interacted. So I'll talk a little bit about that. If you look to the UK, stop, Islam, immigration, the invasion, Britain first. There's been more and more research, particularly since Brexit, looking at the idea of how realistic and symbolic threats, particularly, have led to the issue and have led to people voting for or against Brexit. The US, Islam, the new Nazism, never Sharia law in America, more and more work looking at the Trump election, looking at that in particular, and how Islamophobia really had an impact in 2016 on the election. And India is an area that more and more work is starting to look at, particularly with the 2002 Gujarat violence and also the new citizenship law and the debate surrounding everything that happened around that law and the idea of intergroup violence between Hindu and Muslim. What we see is when we look to religious, research done on religion in an integrated threat, overwhelmingly, whether it's in the United States, the UK, France, or the Netherlands, generally what we find is that in predominantly Christian, whether it's secular or non-secular, Christian-dominated cultures, Muslims are generally seen as realistic threats due to economic conditions, particularly Muslim immigrants. But they're also seen as symbolic threats due to fear of religious and cultural change. The research has found that not only are respondents, whether it's in quantitative or qualitative surveys and research, interviews, ethnography, focus groups, these individuals who are interviewed, Christians particularly, they're very likely to say that these individuals have a right to be here, but they're taking away our jobs. They're changing our society, symbolic threats. And so we see a lot of these things happening, while generally stereotyping and intergroup anxiety are not found to be generally significant forms of prejudice. If we look to India, one of the things we find is in research that I did a while back with some colleagues of mine is how religious someone was. So their level of religiosity was really strongly related to how much they saw someone of a different religion as a symbolic threat. So generally Hindus who were much more religiously devout generally saw Muslims as much more of a symbolic threat. While if we went to the state of Gujarat, for example, those Muslims generally who were very devout saw Hindus as much more of a symbolic threat. So generally here we see the more devoted someone is generally has a very strong influence. There's been quite a bit of work on religion as the separator between the dominant group and the minority group. But immigrants are also a very big area of study. You see here new work over the past couple of years looking at some very interesting signs over the past couple of years. We serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans. 23 million illegals in the United States. Just two pictures from the United States really showing the rhetoric and the debate over Mexican, South American, Central American, Latin American immigration. Some interesting ones from Finland and parts of the Nordic area, really focusing on some stereotypes of the what some would call the typical Russian immigrant. And doctoral student and I looked at the stereotypical depictions of Russians, and generally they're seen as vodka loving. They're seen as many are seen as criminals in Finland, and a lot of this goes back to a long history between Russia and Finland and Russian occupation of Finland and so on, and how many of these stereotypes are just perpetuated over generations. If you look to the idea of the refugee crisis, refugees not welcome, but then you see numerous pictures throughout television, images and throughout social media of long lines and just trails of refugees coming in. It's a very difficult time still throughout Europe. The refugee crisis really isn't over. Immigration there is still in such a difficult period. If we look to the research on immigrants, there's been quite a bit of research looking at Mexican immigrants to the United States. And what a lot of this research has found is that symbolic threat really isn't an important issue. They're really not seen as changing the culture of the United States, because most Americans who are surveyed looking at integrated threat, who are not Mexican, so generally those who identify as American, who are not Mexican, will say that Yeah, they're okay with Mexicans being there as long as they're not impacting my job. So it's more of an economic issue. And that's where basically their prejudice comes from. I don't like Mexicans here because they take my job. I don't mind their food, I don't mind their language, but in some places they do mind their language. But it's much more of a realistic threat, not a symbolic, not a stereotype, not an intergroup anxiety. But then there's research from Stefan Ubada, Martinez, and others looking at immigrants to Spain and Israel, where there it's much more about not realistic threats because of the different processes in place which limit the idea of who can work in certain industries and so on, particularly in Israel. It's much more about stereotypes toward immigrants and the intergroup anxiety. And so those are some that's a very interesting study from 2000 and also from 1998, looking at anxiety and stereotypes, because it's all very context specific. If you look to Russian immigrants in Finland, one of my students, Elvis, and I did quite a bit of research for his PhD, looking at how the typical Finn, I put typical in quotation marks, perceives Russians all the way from early, middle, and late adolescence into adulthood, really tracing how stereotypes, how threat develops through adolescence. And we see it has a great impact, or what really impacts it is media, but also family. And what we find through a lot of this is our prejudices are really impacted by the world around us, our family, our friends, in New Zealand, our whānau, our community, our family really impact how we learn about prejudices. If you look to the EU, during the refugee crisis and post the major refugee movement, realistic and symbolic. There was less of a worry about the about anxieties and stereotyping, but much more of a resource issue, which is the realistic threats. And then the idea of cultures being changed. If you look to France and Germany and the UK, there were a lot of stories and a lot of reports and research showing people were afraid of their cultures changing, about the influx of millions and millions of people changing what it meant to be European, which is a symbolic threat. And the realistic threat came down to the idea that where are we going to house all these immigrants? What about healthcare? What about our economy? What about crime? Going to Finland, for example, when I was living there, we lived in a town maybe 300 kilometers north of Helsinki, Jyväskylä, and my partner and I went away for a few weeks during the summer, came back. It looked very different. The town we had lived in was fairly homogenous, except for the university, which had a lot of international students. Came back after a few weeks, looked around, and there were so many people who were not white. And in a town, that had been so white before, except for university students, to come back in the middle of summer and it looked remarkably different. What happened is a refugee camp was built outside of town. And during the day, many of the men who were there would come into town and hang out at the bus stops. They weren't working. They hung out at the bus stops. It was noticeable. And so what happened is many people in the town started to feel a little uncomfortable because there were probably 20 guys hanging out at the bus stop just doing nothing because there's nothing for them to do, unfortunately. At the refugee camp, there was really no jobs. There was nothing for them to do. So they went into town and just hung out. What this led to was a realistic fear among many people in the town that what are these people doing? What are they going to do? And so this led to some prejudice among individuals because just the amount of people there led to this prejudice that they're going to do something. But we also see that more and more work isn't just looking at immigrants, isn't just looking at religious issues, but it's also going into issues that are more psychological, such as homophobia. You see an issue, God hates fags. We see, a few years ago, 2 lesbians were attacked on, in the UK. What we find is research on integrated threat has been linked with homophobia and right-wing philosophies. So generally those who are more homophobic, fear of, GLBTQ community, generally have more prejudice. Also, those who are more right-wing conservative generally have more prejudice, have more homophobia. Researchers found that African Americans tend to endorse homophobia more and have more prejudice toward the LGBTQ community. But then if we bring this into healthcare, this is where the current study that I'm conducting with a group of researchers comes into play, and also where there's been a little bit of research, particularly in HIV/AIDS. And so we see here, HIV stigma needs to stop. We shouldn't be criminalizing HIV/AIDS. When it comes to integrated threat theory and healthcare, there's been very few studies. What the research has found is that integrated threat best predicts cancer, or better predicts cancer, because people, they don't think they're going to get HIV/AIDS. They think they have a better chance of getting cancer because HIV/AIDS is something that you only get if you're basically doing bad things. And basically, it's almost that old belief that you only get HIV/AIDS if you deserve it. There's much higher prejudice, therefore, towards HIV/AIDS patients than cancer. And some of the research that's been conducted, people would much rather be in a room with a cancer patient than in a room with someone who has HIV/AIDS, because that person is still seen with HIV/AIDS in many pockets of populations as someone who has still committed a sin. And so that's led a lot of us, around the world, and I'll show you what I mean by around the world, to conduct the current study, which explores prejudice toward minority groups that are blamed for the COVID-19 pandemic. So thus far, we've collected data in 4 nations, and in process, many others. And it's quantitative and qualitative data, and it's conducted via an online survey. And we have measures in the survey of social media use. So what I mean by that is we are measuring what social media do people use, what's their most preferred social media every day. So someone might say, I use Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, Insta, but we ask them, what is their most used on a daily basis? We also ask them a litany of questions about to what extent do they believe their social media that they use the most on a daily basis. And by believe, we mean to what extent do they believe their most used social media is fair, objective, represents the public's opinion, is not biased. We're basically asking them to what extent do they believe it's representing the facts. Second of all, when it comes to social media use, we're also exploring to what extent does the respondent share the same opinions as their social media, or to what extent, like if I use Facebook, I would assume my opinions are similar to what's on Facebook, but to what extent do our opinions diverge or converge together? Next, we're also exploring integrated threat. There's a series of scales from Stefan and Gonzalez et al. That measure realistic threat, symbolic threat, and we also have scales of intergroup contact. We have a scale of intergroup anxiety as well. And we also have a scale down below, you'll see intergroup anxiety. We also measure ethnocentrism, because one of the things we're arguing in this study, which really hasn't been looked at before, is I would assert that the more ethnocentric someone is, generally the more intergroup anxiety they would have. Generally, the more they believe their culture is the best, they're going to have more anxiety interacting with others because, well, why should I interact with others who are different than me because my society is the best? And so that's also included. We have a scale of phobia toward COVID-19. And what we've done is we've actually modified a phobia of HIV/AIDS measure to fit with COVID-19. So questions that would say, I'm comfortable shaking hands with someone who has HIV/AIDS. We've modified those items to say, I am comfortable shaking hands with someone who has COVID-19. So there's, I believe, 18 to 20 questions that focus on phobia of COVID-19 or fear of COVID-19. And we have a patient self-advocacy scale, which looks at how much am I an advocate for my own health. One of the beliefs I have is that those who are very much advocates for their own health, who are willing to seek information, willing to stand up for their health care and their rights, generally what the research does show is they have less phobia of health issues because they want to get information. One of the things I would also believe is generally there is work looking at how they're much more likely to question social media. So there should be some sorts of interactions between their social media use, their phobia, their health advocacy, and also since they're more likely to be more discerning media users, that would also impact, I believe, their integrated threat and their prejudice. We also have measures that look at their willingness to voice opinion, going back to the work of Noel Neumann and Spiral of Silence. If you look to the idea of how much their opinion links with media use, we're also asking them in conversations with a Trump supporter, how likely would you be to disagree about his handling of COVID-19? How much do you think your opinion is similar to the public's, to the majority, to the minority, to really look at where they stand politically on some of these matters? And we have some open-ended questions looking at blame attribution. We have two, which coding those, I will say, has been really, really interesting. What we've been looking at is going into the crisis work with blame attribution. This first one is, who is to blame for COVID-19? Now, that may seem like a very simple question, and it's meant to be like a very short question, but the results have been so interesting already. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. The second one is, why has COVID-19 spread so rapidly? And that's basically what we've looked at in the survey. It's about 100 questions, so it's not short, and we know that. But I'll talk a bit about that in a moment here. This is where we're collecting data thus far. And what I'll see is we have the United States. The first part of the survey has been, the first 4 countries has been the US, New Zealand, Italy, and Spain. Now, the US, Italy, and Spain, the 3 countries as of now outside of China that have the highest number of confirmed cases. So for us, that was easy to choose those 3. And I will say in Spain and Italy, we have translators and they've been back translated. So it's been really nice to have the English version, Spanish, and the Italian version of the survey. New Zealand, because, well, we're based in New Zealand, and it's important for us to do research that really represents and really explains and helps us understand where we're from. And also one of our doctoral students, Thao Nguyen, is doing part of this work for her doctoral thesis to really gain a better understanding of COVID-19, the response, and people's understanding from a New Zealand context. So those 4 is where we started. And from there, one of the things I'm very proud of, one of the things I've really encouraged throughout my entire career, and I really encourage others to do, is collaboration. From there, one of the things I did is I started to think, Tao and I were talking about this with another doctoral student of mine who now works at Massey, Diaco, is we started talking about, well, where else can we expand this? And so one of the places we went to was, well, the UK also has a very expansive number of cases. Also, their healthcare system is very different from, say, the UK, from the US and from other countries. So contacted a good colleague of mine in the UK, and so that added our 5th country. And then from there, went to a good colleague in Portugal, made 6, but also very different when it comes to the rate of infection. So we saw a 6th place. And then from there was like, you know what? Turkey also is growing rapidly. And their response, if you look to the media, is different. But also who they're blaming is unique. And so if I go back to that for a moment, what you'll see in the US, blame. We talk to our colleagues in the US, typically media and politicians are blaming the Chinese. In New Zealand, there isn't too much blame being passed around. So an interesting point of comparison. In Spain and Italy, the blame has typically been on Asian and Chinese. So we ended up sticking in our survey with Asian, because it's generally been it's the easier term. So we've been sticking with the translated equivalent of Asian, because it's generally what the media and politicians and others have been sticking with. In the UK, Asian has generally been what has been stuck with. In Portugal, it's generally been Chinese, has been the most equivalent. And we went with Turkey, it's generally been immigrants. That's generally what's been the key issue. Immigrants, or actually surprisingly, Americans. We spoke with our colleague in Turkey. One of the key things the government and media have been blaming COVID-19 on are immigrants and Americans. So we have those countries. We went to Russia, talked with a great colleague there I also have a position at the Higher School of Economics as a fellow. And there it's really not really Asians, it's much more very different groups. And so we're still trying to determine really, but it was much more, not Asians there. So another point of comparison, Kyrgyzstan, it was more minorities, immigrants, ethnic groups. Cameroon, once again, immigrant groups, ethnic groups. And then we started to think, where else can we really look at this? And working with Mohan, we're now trying to expand the study into India and Singapore. Singapore, migrant workers, India, different groups as well. So it's not just people blaming the Asian or Chinese. Different countries are looking at different groups as the one to blame or the scapegoat for the spread. So this is what we're looking at thus far. And Finland, we also have, we're there, it's Asian, but not as strong. And so the amount of blame is much lower in some countries. And so it also offers very interesting points of comparison. Some have much higher rates of spread than others. So it's just starting in some places, data collection, some are finished. I think we're finished in 6 countries with data collection, but we've only done the final analysis for 2 countries. So I'll talk briefly about the 2 countries we've done the analysis for. The first is New Zealand. 319 participants thus far, or that we've collected. And I'll run through the 3 main biggest findings that we've got. First, the more someone believes their most used social media. So let's say someone really thinks that Facebook is telling the truth, that what they read on Facebook is accurate, fair, just. The more they think Asians pose a realistic threat. Symbolic threat was not important, not significant. This was through multiple hierarchical regression modeling. So here we really see that it's the more I believe my social media, I think they pose a realistic threat during COVID-19. Second, the more contact New Zealanders have with Asians, the more they see them posing a realistic and symbolic threat. But we have less anxiety interacting with them. So it's a very interesting mixture here, where the more we interact, the more we see them as a threat, but we have less anxiety. The second part of that finding makes perfect sense. The more we interact, less anxiety. The first part is actually troubling, because the research going back all the way to Allport in 1954 says the more you interact, the less prejudice you should have. But here, the more we're interacting, the more we see they pose a threat. But in the case of COVID-19, that makes sense. Because here, the realistic threat would be COVID-19. And the symbolic threat would be that I don't think we can unbuckle COVID and the threats of COVID-19 on our health from the symbolic threat of changing the culture and what it means to be a New Zealander. And third, Twitter and Snapchat users reported the highest levels of realistic threats. And one of the things we attribute that to is the media richness of Twitter and Snapchat. They're much more visually based and less textually based than other social media forms. So you have less of a chance of reading through articles and getting in-depth knowledge. It's much more, here's a picture and you're done. And so you can just see pictures which impact you a lot more than a picture that you read and maybe get more information that could change your mind or help you develop more in-depth understanding, like on Facebook or other social media platforms. In the US, 288 participants. We had a few more. We had, I think, 310, but we only wanted to focus on those born in the US. So we had, individuals born in the United States. The more someone believes their most used social media, the more they think, Chinese individuals, and so it's people you think are Chinese, pose a realistic and symbolic threat. So in this case, the more I think my social media is accurate, realistic, telling the truth, believable, and so on, the more I think they pose a threat, which is similar to New Zealand in this case, but in New Zealand, it was just realistic. But here, it's all the above, realistic and symbolic. Men and women differed significantly. Men scored higher on anxiety. So men were much more anxious to interact. women were higher on symbolic and symbolic and realistic. What this comes down to is men scored higher on affective prejudice, but women scored higher on cognitive threat. And this is intriguing because there's quite a bit of division in the literature on this, where there is no definitive answer on whether men are more cognitive or affective, and if women are more affective or cognitive with prejudice. And so for us, it was really intriguing. We didn't see any difference in New Zealand on men and women, really. And in the US, to see this clear difference shows that men respond more affectively. They get much more emotional on prejudice, while women, much more cognitive. So for us, we're wanting to explore this more because we're not finding any clear, rational reason for it at this time to really make a clear justification as to why this is the case. So I'd be interested if anyone has any real reasons for this, please send them to me. I'm happy to discuss this further because we have ideas, but they're not backed up by clear justification at this time. And finally, Democrats believed Chinese pose a higher symbolic threat than Republicans or independents. And at first I read this and Democrats are those who are more liberal in their beliefs. At first this disheartened me a little bit, but then I thought about it a little bit more, and basically what this is saying is that, those who are more liberal leaning believe that the Chinese in the US during the COVID-19 crisis are more likely, there's more of a fear from this political affiliation that they are, changing, there's more of a fear that they could change the culture. And this is another one where I've talked to a few colleagues and friends where they've said, well, it makes sense because these are generally individuals who are higher in education, but it doesn't, because I looked at the results and there was no difference on educational level. So scratch that idea. Religion, there was no difference there. Democrats, Republicans were similar. Scratch that idea. Age, no, scratch that. Where they lived, no difference. And so I couldn't really figure out why that was the case. It could just be a random case. And so this is another one where I'm still trying to figure out why this was the case. It could just be the sample. I'm open to ideas. So moving forward, thus far we're analyzing the qualitative and quantitative data for Spain, Italy, New Zealand, and the US. As you can imagine, we have quite a few papers planned for all of this data. And just with not only these countries, but all of the other countries, we have quite a few studies planned. And since we're collecting data in many countries, not in English language, that's also leading to a lot of translation issues, a lot of reliability issues for coding. It's leading to a lot of work, which is actually very interesting and fun. The data is happening right now in many other countries, the data collection. In fact, this morning I received the final translations from Finland, and so those will go out very soon for data collection. But we need more collaborators. So I will say, if people are interested, please let me know. The key thing for us is any country we collect data in, we will need to work with those collaborators on certain protocols that need to be followed, certain standards that have to be followed. In Brazil is watching this and they want to collect data, we would work with them and our other Portuguese researchers on making sure the scales or that the instrument is translated properly. And any study that uses that data from Brazil, that the leader of that team in Brazil would get authorship on that study that uses data that they collected. And I think it's important that we work together. And so that's one of the things we've been doing for years, any of my research teams. So the goals, just to sum up and then I'll finish and let this be out there for all of you, is to look at social media and integrated threat. There's been a lot of work looking at intergroup contact, integrated threat, looking at other sociological constructs, integrated threat. But for us, social media is such a huge construct. How we use social media, why we use social media. People read the journal articles and actually, care. You can publish all the journal articles you want, it makes no difference. I think for us, one of the ultimate goals besides academic publishing is to develop ways to enhance social media's responses to prejudice. One of the things I've been really happy about living in New Zealand is the way the New Zealand government has developed our COVID-19 response, level 4, 3, 2, and 1, not only the public campaign, but the social media campaigns and our communication campaign has been really nice to observe, not only as a resident, but also as a communication researcher. I think the more we can learn about how people respond to a virus through social media, how they use social media, how they learn from it, the better we can work whenever we have a virus, whenever we have a health issue or any kind of issue, to counter prejudice. We can work with government and industry to respond to such issues. So I really want to take what we learn here and use it and actually help work with government, work with industry, but also work with healthcare. One of the things we see is, how does health fear influence prejudice? We see, if you go back all the way to, 1980s, the idea of what they called gay cancer. The idea of rhetorically labeling something gay cancer wasn't until it wasn't until Ronald Reagan actually talked about HIV/AIDS, and actually the CDC and other groups started to look into this, that some of the stigma went away about HIV/AIDS, but it's still there. And so we really have to look at, how does prejudice influence how we even talk about viruses? The idea that we're not calling this the Wuhan virus, that we're not giving a virus a physical location in its name, is so important. I was having a discussion with a family member, and they were like, why aren't we calling this the Wuhan or the China virus? Because it's not. And these are important conversations, and I think we really need to look at calling something like the Wuhan virus, the China 19 virus, is prejudicial, and how those things make a difference, and how we can link that to government and really try to influence how we talk about these issues. And so those are two of the big goals that we really want to do in our research group. And we'd be so interested if others really want to join us on this journey to really try to make a difference. And so with that, what I'd like to do is thank everyone for listening, for watching. And once again, thank the Care Center and thank Mohan Dutta and everyone involved. Really, thank you all so much for your time, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.